I will walk you through a little bit the plans for the phone lecture before Juan starts the presentation. First of all, we would like to apologize as well for some problems with the Zoom links. We will make sure to fix this for the next sessions. But talking about the next sessions, the next session you see that is going to be in January 25th. So we will not have a phone lecture in December. And the next session will be delivered by Maria Dornelas, and she will be talking about the geography of biodiversity change in marine and terrestrial assemblages. So as well, please remember that we will start as well organizing and talking a bit about the next biennial conference in Prague. So let's wait a few minutes more. Just as always, this would be the question and answers. So as always, we will be, after the session, after Juan's talk, you will have the chance of asking questions just using the question and answer box or raising your hand, and then you can place the question yourself. Okay, so while we're waiting the others, I will introduce our next speaker, Juan. Thank you so much for being here today. Juan Rocha is a research scientist currently at the Stockholm Resilience Center, where he co-leads the theme on complex systems. His research questions are oriented to understanding critical transitions from regime shifts into ecological systems, but as well to collective actions in society. Currently, he's focusing on the idea of cascading effects. For example, how a critical transition in ecosystem in the world can impact the livelihood of other ecosystems tipping over. Juan is interested in methods for identifying resilience surrogates, but as well as misperceptions of feedbacks and their consequences. He finds inspiration in complex system science, the use of mathematical models, networks, and other computational methods to understand social and ecological complexity. So Juan, all for you. I will stop sharing, and it's your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Let me share my desktop. Can you confirm if everyone is seeing? Super, thanks a lot.
Yes,
let me just put the full screen, and then we're ready to go. Super, welcome everyone. Thanks for your patience and despite the technical mishaps for showing up today to this lecture, and thank you for the opportunity and the invitation to share some of my research with this community. Today I'll be presenting a paper that was recently published. The title is Ecosystems Are Showing Symptoms of Resilience Loss. Long story short, I use some well-established methods to measure resilience and trying to figure out where in the world ecosystems are showing symptoms of proximity to tipping points or that the potential for regime shifts might occur. During this talk, first I will walk you through a couple of, well, before we start, the slides are available on my website. That's the address. If you want to go back later, or if the video has delays for you. All text in blue are actual links, so I often put links to external resources or papers in case you want to read further on some of the techniques and methods that I'll be discussing today. First, I would like to do a jargon check, just to introduce the key central characters of the story, the two concepts that I will be talking around over the whole lecture, to make sure we are on the same page. Then I will dive a little bit deeper on the theory and methods on how to measure resilience, and then I hope by the end of today you will have some intuition of where on Earth ecosystems are showing symptoms of resilience loss. We start with the dictionary definition of resilience. If you talk to my mom, who is not an academic, she's not a scientist, and you talk about resilience to her, the thing that she will be thinking about is the capacity of something to recover quickly from difficulties, or a substance to spring back into shape. So when you talk to layman persons of non-academic people, that's what they're thinking about. And resilience, in that sense, has a very well-defined bounded property. It's just recovery quick from some. Of course, scientists are a bit more nuanced. The definition change I'll be talking today about is one that was reviewed by my colleague Carl Folke at the Stockholm Resilience Center. He wrote a review not so many years ago. He revisit how many people has been defining resilience and came up with this definition that is general enough to be applied to different places and contexts. He defines this as the capacity of any system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change, so as to still retain essentially the same function, structure, feedbacks, and therefore identity. I study resilience in the context of regime shifts. They are large, abrupt, and persistent changes in the function and structure of ecosystems. By ecosystems, I mean social ecological systems. I also include the relationship that humans play on nature. Some of the canonical examples of these regime shifts are the shift from forest to savanna. The picture in the background is a picture taken while flying over the Chaco region in Latin America, where some of these forests are being converted to grasslands or pastures for cattle ranching and agricultural productivity. Another canonical example is that of coral transitions. These beautiful three-dimensional structures provide habitat for many species and many important ecosystem services like tourism, food production, or coastal protection. But coral reefs can be transformed from this three-dimensional structure to simplify ones like soft corals of corallimorph variants that provide less of those benefits to people. Last example is that of fisheries collapse, where the important fish commercially stocks crashes, and they get trapped in low productivity regimes. By doing so, they affect the livelihoods of millions of people around the planet and the source of nutrients for many communities. So what's the relationship between these phenomena, the regime shifts, and resilience? Back in '73, when Holling started defining resilience, he did it by defining as the magnitude of change that the system can absorb without undergoing a regime shift. In this graphical example on the left, we have an ecosystem state on the bottom axis and some conditions on the parallel axis or the orthogonal axis there. You can think of ecosystem state as being the density, for example, of forest versus grassland, or the density of coral reefs versus the alternative configuration. And there's certain region of that parameter space that's between point F1 and F2 here, two basins of attraction exist, or two different equilibrium. And under those conditions, a perturbation might shift the system from being on one configuration to another, like forest to savanna, or the high productivity fisheries versus the low productivity fisheries. In that particular mathematical framework, resilience is then the size of the basin of attraction. People trying to quantify that by trying to get, with some statistical techniques, an intuition of what is the depth of that basin, the slope, or the proximity to the boundary. Already this type of conceptualization was put forward by Bill Clark in 1975, where he was at the time a postdoc. Now he's a famous professor at Harvard. At the time, he was a postdoc working with Holling in IASA. Those type of ideas have been taken again or revived in literature in physics and ecology for people who wants to get into some intuition on how the size of the basin is changing over time, or as you put ecosystems through different types of disturbances or pressures. So something that is still debated up today is whether resilience is a property of the system as a whole or the regime, so the basin of attraction. Whether it's a property instead of the disturbance, whether it's the amount of pressure that you can put before it tips over to the other regime. And more recently, scholars like Steve Carpenter and collaborators are begging the users of the concept to define a priori resilience of what to what, so people kind of talk about the same things, so don't get lost in translation when the boundaries of the systems are not clear. Right, before I move into the more theoretical and methodological ways to measure resilience, I just want to emphasize why these phenomena are important. Regime shifts can reduce the benefits that people get from nature. They are often difficult to anticipate and hard and costly to reverse because of the hysteresis or the pathway to collapse is different from the pathway to recovery. It's very difficult and sometimes unethical to perform experiments at the scale that is necessary to understand the feedbacks. So if you're thinking of the forest to savanna transition in the Amazon, it's hypothesized that a tipping point might be around 40% of deforestation, but it's unethical to perform that experiment despite we're approximating quickly the rates of deforestation required to achieve the system. So for some system, it's not easy to experiment and get into defining whether the system has these alternative states or not. Because of this limitation, they are often studied in isolation. So about 10 years or so ago, I started studying this phenomenon for my PhD. I was very interested in how do we compare them, what are the main drivers and consequences of regime shifts globally. But one of the questions that has been keeping me awake at night during the last couple of years is where on earth regime shifts are likely to occur, and answering that depends on our ability to observe and measure resilience from empirical data. So to answer that question, I'll look into resilience indicators or statistical techniques to try to get an insight of how the basin of attraction is changing. First family of metrics is called critical slowing down. Here on the left, we have an explanatory figure by a paper by Martin Schaeffer in Nature, where he explains the theory. And if you're interested in applying it to your datasets, the papers on the right are a good starting source. When you have a big basin of attraction, the recovery rate is high. And if you measure the development over time of that system, you will see some fluctuations. And if you plot the state of the system today against the state of the system yesterday, you will find a cloud of point that has some statistical properties, such as the correlation and the standard deviation, that is characteristic of a big basin of attraction. But when that basin of attraction gets smaller, in this case by losing depth, that basin of attraction gets flattened on the bottom, and that induces a little bit of more variability on the time series. That means when you disturb that system, it will take longer to recover, to come back to equilibrium. And in the state of today versus the state of yesterday type of plot, what you will find is an increasing autocorrelation and variance for that time series. That happens precisely because the basin of attraction is getting flattened. You're losing depth on that basin of attraction. And the signature of that is increases in variance and autocorrelation. Those symptoms are known as critical slowing down. So the system is getting slower at recovering and going back to equilibrium. Other type of statistical metrics that are useful to detect signals there are the skewness and kurtosis, big changes in skewness and kurtosis, which are the third and the fourth moment of that particular distribution. The advantage with this type of metrics, they are statistical techniques, are easy to compute, and you can scale up quite easily for say, remote sensing data. The problem is interpretation is often difficult if you don't have a ground truth. So people often have equations and models where they know the truth, and then they test these statistical techniques. If you have an idea of what are the mechanisms underlying your loss of resilience, you can use scale to the whole planet. You can get different life evidence that the system are losing resilience by being able to calculate things like thresholds or how the eigenvalues change over time. And if you have a special data, you might be able to play around size distributions or Fourier transforms or things like that. Okay, this type of techniques has been applied in rainforests around the world. Berbeset and colleagues applied to the normalized difference vegetation index and vegetation optical depth, which are two remote sensing products available for vegetation. Despite the time series are not very long in time, they use a couple of decades, they can use a space for time substitution to gain insights on where resilience is being lost or where ecosystems are getting slower at recovering. That's what they show on the bottom panel. So the darker the red, the higher the temporal autocorrelation, and that they did an analysis and showed that the increase on that particular signal coincides with reducing precipitation and confirm a threshold of 1,500 millimeters that has been proposed a couple of decades back on theoretical models. So the methods work and in certain situations even confirm some of the theory of what are the thresholds at which forests might shift to savannas. However, other scholars warn that there is limitations of this type of approaches because this type of early warnings fail when the transitions or the regime shifts are driven by stochastic processes. So when the process has a lot of noise, the signal to noise ratio might not be optimal, and you might end up not being able to detect regime shifts with these methods. To address that limitation, Titus and Watson very recently on the Journal of Theoretical Ecology provided an alternative. They call it critical speeding up. Back to the cartoon on the left, we have a big basin of attraction, so a system with high resilience. The cartoon in the middle shows where critical slowing down excels, which is when you lose depth on that basin of attraction. But then Titus and Watson showed that when the basin of attraction is not losing depth, but actually getting narrower, it loses size indeed, but it's not because of that, but because it's getting narrower, then the system becomes more vulnerable to stochastic transitions, to the noise inherent in the dynamics. And they show that when that happens, the signal or the signature of that type of transition is decreasing variance and autocorrelation. The third metric that I'll be using is the fractal dimension. This type of methods have been used widely in the engineering and medicine science to measure the ability of machines or people to recover to stresses. So if you have been in the doctor and your doctor has been measuring how your heart works and plotting time series of how your heart is behaving under different pressures, chances are what they're measuring is the fractal dimension of that particular time series. The advantage of this is very well understood the mathematics of that particular metric. So fractal dimensions for time series is a number between 1 and 2, and higher numbers always means better, or which means better resilience. And the way of interpreting it, Geoffrey West in his book in 2017 suggests that the way of interpreting it is a high fractal dimension means that the system has a big repertoire of behaviors to deal with disturbances. So it's a proxy of adaptive capacity. If you're interested on the theory and how to measure it, then there is a couple of references there, one from the medical literature and another from statistics. All right. So with those three umbrella type of metrics, a critical slowing down, speeding up, and the fractal dimension, I went into looking into data where I could actually check how ecosystems might be changing. To do that, I look into the European Space Agency's climate essential variables. They are being collected through remote sensing products, time series of how the climate is changing, and some of those variables relate to primary productivity in ecosystems. For terrestrial systems, I use gross primary productivity. We have time series from 2001 to 2018 of weekly observations, and what it measures is the amount of carbon that plants capture where they do photosynthesis. Ecosystem respiration is the amount of carbon that they respire or they produce by metabolism, and leaf area index is an index of the amount of area that is covered by leaves on a particular place. For all of these time series, we have weekly observations for about 20 years, plus minus some years, depending on the dataset. For marine systems, I use chlorophyll A, or the color of the ocean. That's an indicator of how much phytoplankton is produced there. It's a good proxy of the amount of chlorophyll or the primary productivity for ocean creatures. So all in all, the terrestrial and marine dataset put together is about more than 1 million pixels, so more than 1 million time series of weekly observations, a quarter of degree resolution. So what do we do with this data? Let's see here an example for 1 pixel. This is gross primary productivity from 1 pixel, and then I clean up the data in a way that I get rid of seasonal variability, and all is left is these fast variations on the fast time scale. These time series are centered in zero mean and univariance, and then any changes on the statistics should be result of changes on the basin of attraction, not on leftover variability from other time scales. So with this is about 2 decades of data. I take about 10 years of data as a rolling window, and as I'm rolling that window toward the future, I'm calculating these indicators of resilience or these statistics, the standard deviation, autocorrelation, lag one, and so forth. So those are the resulting time series that you see on the panel. On the top of that, I do a segmented regression that allows me to identify a point in time at which the particular statistic start increasing or decreasing significantly. That point in time allows me to compare how good are doing the different metrics on the same time series, or how different metrics are doing across different datasets. So it gives me an intuition of the precision on time where the early warning start manifesting itself. In addition to that, for 1 pixel, it's easy to inspect visually whether things increase or decrease, but for 1 million, we cannot do that. So in order to circumvent that problem, I calculate this delta, or this blue bar, which is measuring how big was the jump, or how big was the increase or decrease on these statistics. So this is nothing different than the difference between the maximum point and the minimum point of that statistic. On 1 pixel, it doesn't tell me much, but when you have all the pixels of the world, and you can construct and compare with the probability distribution of that statistics against all other pixels to see which are outliers, what is abnormal, and what is normally expected. So let me zoom back again, and The first result of this analysis is that the genetic resilience indicator doesn't necessarily align with critical slowing down on speeding up theories. These theories expect the standard deviation and autocorrelation to move in tandem to both increase or decrease. But for most of the pixels analyzed, actually, the pattern is what we see on the screen for this particular pixel, that one increases and the other decreases. It seems like a contradiction. I will explain you at the end of the talk why is that so, but it's not a contradiction. Most of the early warnings are a combination of kurtosis, skewness, or the other suspects. Okay, with that delta, then, as I mentioned, we can construct this probability distribution. That's important because we don't have ground truth in this study. We don't know at the pixel level where a regime shift has happened or not. But in order to identify what is a big jump on those statistics with respect to what is normally expected, we can use this probability distribution to distinguish that. So it's bimodal because delta is very unlikely to be zero. Here, there is always going to be a number, and that number is always going to be either positive or negative, and that's why you get these two modes, above and below zero. The orange lines on this graph show the 95 and 5%. So anything above this line is an outlier on the top, on the right end of that graph, and anything below this line is an outlier on the bottom side. So that will represent a pixel that is showing very strong signals of resilient loss with respect to what is expected by the biome. If any of you run this analysis in 10 years' time and realize that a pixel that today is in the tail of the distribution and moves back to the center of the distribution, that could also be interpreted as resilience gain, which is an advantage of comparing or being able to compare across the planet. Now, bear in mind that the number is not what matters. It's not that 0.25 is resilience loss or not. That 0.25 will change depending whether you are talking about a tropical moist forest or a tundra. The 0.25 might be on the end of the distribution for one biome and be part of the normal expected variability for another. So it's not the number, it's the position on that distribution. So now that we have clarified what the delta is and how do we define when a pixel is showing symptoms of resilient loss, then we can start looking at spatial explicit results on where is this happening. So that's the map in front of you. The pixels where we detected resilient loss, so that are at the end of that distribution are colored in full color. The ones with semi-transparency are the ones that are aligned on the normal expected variability. What we find is about a third of the pixels of terrestrial ecosystems are showing symptoms of resilience loss, and the most common places where you find them is boreal forest and tundra, so up in the Arctic boreal areas of Russia and North America. Besides those big results, the other places of the world also agree with other studies and other datasets. You see, for example, that a bunch of pixels in the Amazon rainforest are showing symptoms of resilience loss, especially in the southeast area where a lot of the deforestation and fires are happening over the last years. Drylands are another type of ecosystem that are strongly showing symptoms of resilience loss. You see them in Northern Australia, in Central Asia, parts of the Sahel and central plains of North America, and the Indian summer monsoon is or the Indian subcontinent is showing strong symptoms of resilience loss on a place of the world where vegetation depends of the Indian summer monsoon or the strength of rain falling up there. So some of the areas aligns with what is reported in other papers, and that kind of gives me confidence that the results are actually something we can trust. When we look at the marine systems, I would like to draw your attention that we don't have data for the Arctic and Antarctic regions of the planet. Those are the regions where scientists believe most of changes will be happening because the Arctic is already warming 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. Despite those limitations, we find strong symptoms of resilient loss in places where scientists have for long expected that they might occur. Those are upwelling systems. Those are systems where the nutrients to the surface, and that's a food marine food productivity. What happens is the Humboldt current, the Canary Islands upwelling system, or the Benguela system. In all of them, we see clusters of areas where the symptoms are being strong. Another interesting example is this blurb in the Central Atlantic and part of the Caribbean Basin. A paper independently reported that that part of the world is are reporting decline in primary productivity because a high concentration of saline waters on the top. That's another mechanism that stops that water mixing and nutrients inputs into the system. Despite it aligns with some of the hypotheses posed by other scientists, we miss, however, some of the regime shifts that has been documented. We are unable to detect the bleaching events of the great coral reefs that has happened between 2016 and 2018. About 70% of the corals there have started undergoing regime shifts. We don't see either hypoxia events of the east coast of the US. We see the big hypoxia events in the Gulf of Mexico, but not the small cases that has been documented on the global oxygen networks and other resources. So it works for certain things, but not for others. Can we trust the signals? As I said before, most scientists usually have an equation or some ground truth, and then apply these early warnings and see whether they can detect things or not. But in this particular case, it's an observational study. We don't have ground truth. How do we make sure, or how do we assess the quality of these predictions? I tried 3 different types of robust tests. On the interest of time, I will only present 2. The first one is the graph presented on the top. I selected 500 pixels where at least 3 different metrics suggested resilience loss. Then I calculated again my 5 different indicators for each of the data sets. And then I permutate the time series. Permutate means that I reshuffle the ordering of the events. When you reshuffle the order, the numbers are actually the same, but the order is different. And then when that happens, the strength of the signal disappears. It goes back to what is expected by each biome on the particular indicators. So what that means is that ordering matters, and the signals are not an artifact of the data set. They're actually there. Once you randomize the same data in time, then the signals are lost. The second type is comparing these generic indicators, which is based on some statistics on the time series, against the model-based indicators. The model-based indicators are a more robust way of trying to get insights into resilience loss, but they are computationally expensive. So you cannot run that for the whole planet. What I did then was selected 100 pixels where things were not detected, 100 pixels where they were detected, and then try again with this different method. This different method allows you to compute the leading eigenvalue of that time series and how it changed over time. If that leading eigenvalue goes above 1, that's a much more stronger line of evidence that the system is departing from this basin of attraction, maybe going to an alternative state or going to a chaotic thread, but it's for sure being destabilized. What we found is that for 50% of the pixels that we test on the marine dataset, the second method supported the conclusion of resilience loss. For 30% in gross primary productivity, the second method supported the resilience loss. For the pixels where the eigenvalue didn't went above 1, there was still a displacement toward 1. That means that if the time series would have been a bit longer, probably that criteria of crossing the eigenvalue would have been crossed. On the other hand, this comparison of methods allow us to see that the terrestrial ecosystem respiration was not producing good signals. So it allows you also to select what could be good observables of resilience loss in the future. All right. So what lessons we can learn from this kind of statistical exercise of trying to understand how the basins of attractions in ecosystem change? First, I show you that it seems to be a contradiction between critical slowing down and critical speeding up because the signals are not showing in tandem. It is not actually a contradiction. Other researchers in ecology who experiment with ecosystems in petri dishes in a very experimental microscale has shown that when a community of bacteria is subjected to multiple drivers, that you can increase salinity, pH, and temperature, and the community will collapse with any of them. When there is multiple drivers, you might have these contradictory signals, meaning that the basin of attraction is getting shallower on one of the dimensions, say temperature, but it's getting narrower in another dimension, say pH. When you have these multidimensional basins of attraction, you might have these apparent contradictory signals, but it's not a contradiction. It's just that the ecosystem is subject to different drivers. I would like to emphasize that the patterns that are detected with this study align with different studies that are using different data sets and methods. I, however, believe there is an underestimation on my results. And it's mainly because of the limitation of data resolution. So I believe, for example, we were not able to detect the hypoxia events because the pixels are too big and the sequencing time or the frequency in time is weakly. It might not be fast enough to match the time scale of the phenomena at hand. I also say that there is no ground truth in this study, and because of that, it's very important to study the distribution of that statistic and how it can help you inform what is considered to be a big jump or a significant increase on a signal or not. Despite these limitations, the study does help us identify areas for management. You have an explicit map of where resilience is being eroded, and then you can then prioritize places, either countries where the areas of resilience loss are larger, so on the top Russia, Canada, or the States, or where the proportion of territory is big, so where they're dealing with a lot of ecosystems that significantly impact their natural assets. For example, here, Kazakhstan and Mongolia, two countries with a very large areas of drylands, are being on the top of that list. On the right, you see countries ranked by the diversity of ecosystems showing symptoms of resilience loss. So the results I present are on biomes. There are about 16 biomes of natural, of terrestrial ecosystems, but ecosystems are over 800 type of ecosystems. And out of those 800, over 80 unique ecosystems are showing symptoms of resilience loss in the States, China, Russia, and so forth. And when you rank them by the proportion of territory, then biodiverse countries like Mexico, Brazil, India, Colombia start popping up on that list. So despite the limitations, these type of results help identify first, who has agency to make a difference. You can use these maps to address companies, municipalities, or countries to help and include these results on the vulnerability of ecosystems into their planning and where they extract their products or how they operate or plan their territories. In a previous work, I have shown that regime shifts can be interconnected. People do have some modeling evidence that temperature is a key factor. So climate is a typical mediator that can connect ecosystems. In another paper, I showed that it's not just climate, other mechanisms are at play. But despite this collection of hypotheses, there is no empirical evidence of where in the world ecosystems are connected or how these cascading effects really occur. I think these maps that we have just produced will help us identify whether the symptoms in one place are related to symptoms elsewhere, and that would constitute empirical evidence of cascading effects. So I hope that would be an avenue of research where this work can be developed. And then if that happens, then we can use that network to study the structure and manage avoiding escalating crises. So to find ecosystems or places of the world that have high priority, because if they tip over, that might increase the probability of other places tipping over. I think that's all I had to share for today. I hope you have learned something about regime shifts and how to measure resilience. I also hope that sparks some interesting questions on your own research in biogeography. And if you have any research ongoing that might be related to regime shift, please do not hesitate to contact me. I'm more than keen to learn how the two fields can complement each other. If you're interested on the slides, again, there is the link. The link to the paper is also open access, and those are my contacts if you have questions or suggestions for the future. Thank you very much, and then I will open the floor for questions.